Okay, so I'm going to explain the additional homework exercises in week 5 in an attempt to explain mediating variables to you guys. So first of all, the week 5 homework, exercise 1.1, you have 1 DV, which is results on a Japanese oral test marked out of 50. You have 4 IV, so does the student have a Japanese friend, yes or no, is dichotomist. Level of involvement in Japanese cultural activities, level of motivation and opportunity to practice Japanese. These latter 3 are all metric, continuous variables. So the first question asks us to think of a hypothesis suitable to hierarchical regression. So in particular, a mediational type of hypothesis, or one with a possible causal sequence, such as X affects results on the Japanese test indirectly through its effect on X. So for example, we might say that those who speak Japanese better than others are more likely to have a Japanese friend living in Melbourne and are more likely to be involved in Japanese cultural activities. So we think people who have a Japanese friend and are more involved in Japanese cultural activities are more likely to perform well on a Japanese oral test. However, we also propose that the reason that these 2 variables increase performance on a Japanese oral test is because they increase level of motivation and the opportunity to practice Japanese. So what we're saying is that the relationship between having a Japanese friend or not and degree of involvement in Japanese activities with results on a Japanese oral test is mediated by level of motivation and opportunity to practice Japanese. So these variables, those who have a friend and are more involved in Japanese activities are more likely to be more motivated, and have more opportunity to practice Japanese, and this is what causes them to score more highly on a Japanese oral test. Okay, so level of motivation and opportunity to practice Japanese are the potential mediating variables, which is question 1b. Question 1a is our hypothesis, which is what I was just explaining then. 1c, how would you arrange the hierarchical regression in order to test this hypothesis? So you would enter does the student have a Japanese friend living in Melbourne and level of involvement in Japanese cultural activities. You'd enter those in the first step, and that would allow you to see whether these 2 variables actually have a relationship with performance on the Japanese oral test, a direct relationship or not. And then you would enter, you'd leave these 2 variables in the second step, and you would add an addition, level of motivation and opportunity to practice Japanese. So in step 2 you'd have the 4 variables. Now if these 2 variables were mediating the relationship between these 2 variables, then these two variables would be significant at step 2, and they would explain they would have a relationship with the DV, result on a Japanese oral test. And these 2 variables would show a significant relationship with Japanese oral test at step 1, and this relationship would either no longer be present at step 2 once these 2 variables were added, or it'd be reduced. So I'll just show you what I mean by that a little bit more. First of all, on page 166 in your textbook, 4 conditions are outlined that need to be met in order to identify a mediating variable. So first of all, the predictor, in this case, Japanese friend or not, and involvement in cultural activities, needs to be significant related to the mediator. So in the week 5 homework, that is significantly related to motivation and opportunity to practice. The predictor must also be significantly related to the dependent variables. So whether or not you have a Japanese friend and degree of involvement in cultural activities must be significantly related to performance on an oral test. And then the mediator must also be related to the dependent variables. So the degree of motivation and opportunity to practice must be significantly related to oral performance on the Japanese test. Excuse me. And finally, the impact of the predictor on the dependent variable must be less after controlling for the mediator. So the impact of whether or not you have a Japanese friend and degree of involvement in activity, in Japanese activities, impact of these two variables on oral performance on a Japanese test must be reduced once motivation and opportunity to practice are entered into the regression at step 2. So if we go back and have a look at my Venn diagram from my correlations, what we're saying is that, say this represents, let's just take one of the predictors and one of the mediators. Say this represents degree of involvement in cultural activities. This is performance on the oral test, and this is, let's say, motivation. The degree of involvement in cultural activities when entered in step 1, let's pretend it's being entered alone. So let's just ignore the other two, the other predictor and the other mediation variable for the moment. In step 1, when you enter degree of involvement in cultural activities alone, the regression is giving you this relationship here. It's showing this degree of relationship between the predictor and the DV. So we're getting a nice strong correlation or prediction from IV1 to the DV in the first step of the regression. In the second step, when you add level of motivation, this shared variance between these two variables is being removed from the regression. So if there is actually a relationship between IV1 and IV2, and there's a relationship between the IV1 and the DV and IV2 and the DV, which is represented by F, so there's overlapping variance between the two predictors, and both of the predictors overlap with the DV, then the relationship between IV1 and the DV in the second step will be reduced because you're taking this variance here out at step 2. So in step 1, when IV1's not in it, IV1 and the DV show this much relationship. But in step 2, when IV2 is added, if it has a relationship with IV1 and both of these variables also have a relationship with the DV, you get this degree of shared variance overlap between the three variables, which is as represented by F. And that's removed when measuring the degree of relationship between IV1 and the DV. So if IV2 mediates the relationship between IV1 and the DV, the relationship at the second step will be a lot smaller once IV2 has been entered into the relationship. Okay, so that's basically what we're showing here, what we're looking at. That's workbook 2. Whoops. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we're going to have a look at the data. So here's our correlation table, which we'll get back to. Let's just have a look at the regression first, the results of the regression. So first of all, both steps are significant. So the first step, when the predictors are added, there's a significant R squared of 0.32. And then the second step, when the mediators are added, there's a significant R squared change. So an additional, the first two predictors explain 32% of the variance, and then when you add the second step of a lot of predictors, which are the mediators, so when you add level of motivation and opportunity to practice Japanese, they explain an additional 17% of the variance in the model. So we go down here and we can see that Japanese friends and involvement in cultural activities have good zero-order correlations, and they both predict performance on the oral test significantly. But when you go to the second step and you add opportunity to practice and motivation, Japanese friends still predicts performance on the oral test significantly, but the correlation is reduced, so the partial correlation is lower than the raw correlation, and involvement in cultural activities no longer predicts performance on the oral test significantly at all. Okay, so what that suggests is that there is likely to be, we need to look at the reason for this, but suggests that there's likely one or two of these two variables, opportunity to practice and motivation, is indeed mediating the relationship between Japanese friends and involvement in cultural activities, because these variables, one of the variables is no longer related to the oral performance on the oral test at all, and the other variable's relationship is reduced. So we'll go back up here. So both of the possible mediators at step 2 were significant. So let's look with Japanese friends. Japanese friends correlates with both opportunity to practice and motivation, and involvement in cultural activities also correlates with both of those. So what's happening is that people who are more involved in cultural activities have a greater opportunity to practice Japanese and are more motivated to practice or to learn Japanese, and that accounts for the relationship between involvement in cultural activities and performance on the oral test. So because that accounts for the relationship, it means there's a lot of shared variance between involvement in cultural activities and opportunity to practice and motivation, and so the significant relationship between involvement in cultural activities and performance on the oral test is no longer there, is no longer present in step 2 once these two variables have been added, because the unique variance between involvement in cultural activities and performance on the oral test that we saw at step 1 is now no longer unique variance because it's shared with these two variables. Okay? Now, people who have Japanese friends, the Japanese friends variable remains significant at step 2, so people who have Japanese friends perform better on the oral test regardless of their degree of motivation or opportunity to practice. This has an independent relationship between Japanese friends and performance on the oral test, but the relationship was slightly reduced, which suggests that part of the relationship between Japanese friends and performance on the oral test is due to opportunity to practice and motivation. Okay? So, that's it.